Now I can hear, so.
All right, so we're
Yay.
good to go. So I'm going to turn it over to Donna, and thank you again for coming out today.
All right, well, it's my turn. I'm Donna, and I am with the Historical Society here in Oakwood. And this is something that is kind of near and dear to my heart, because when I first moved into Oakwood, I heard all of the stories about how wonderful people's houses were and how they had all these famous residents and everything else. And I went on a journey to find out about our wonderful 1958 house. And my package here is about 4 years worth of research to find out who the original builder was, the land and everything else. So it's been quite a journey. And after countless Google searches, I was fortunate enough to find who the original owner was, but pleased to find out he was actually still alive. And I was able to write letters to him, and he was nice enough to not think that I was a crazy woman and answer back. And we got several 2-page letters from him, and he gave us incredible detail. Architect was, how he moved in first, how his wife helped him then when he got married and married somebody from Kettering, how they picked out a carpet together. Thank goodness the old carpet's not there, it's gone. But it was just a very wonderful, warm story about the house and having their kids and everything. He solved the mystery for my husband and I. On the corner of the house by the driveway, there's a huge chunk out of a piece of brick. We thought, what in the heck could hit a house that hard that would fall off? Well, it turns out he and his wife, shortly after they got married, bought an Airstream trailer. And he decided to back it down the driveway. And of course, the Airstream got a dent, and so did our house. So we now have a picture of that dent in our house, and we know what it's all about. It's wonderful to get that kind of feedback. So we were also blessed with the fact that we had a next door neighbor who bought the house from its original owner. There was a doctor that lived in the house, and when the doctor became infirmed, he sold the house. And so our neighbor literally was the second occupant of that house. And so over the years, he was able to get us a list of all the other people that were neighbors of his. So we have a really neat chronology of our home. But it took, as I said, it took an excruciating long time. So by way of introduction, let me say, boy, do I wish I had known you earlier, because it would have saved me a heck of a lot of time. So with the help of Google, though, as I said, I found a lot. And today we're going to do a follow-up to the April presentation. If you missed it, Tom Morrow, who's kind of our expert on the platting of Oakwood, can tell you how the original city was broken up. Now we have Bill here to help us take the time to go through and see what we can do to find out not only the series of owners, but like my delightful stories about the history of the house, who really lived there, what did there, and all those kinds of things. So I think I'll let Bill do the most of it, other than I want to tell you, this is Bill Stolz. He is the head librarian for the southeast branch of Dayton Metro Library. And he also has a master's in archival history. He's done a lot of work. We were talking before the meeting that he worked in Covington and
worked for the Kenton County Public Library in Covington, and we used to do
Yeah,
walking
Covington.
tours.
So
So we
he's
would
got all
do
that
lots of
information.
house research to talk about the
Yeah.
people that lived in the home.
And he's been in Missouri, he's been in North Carolina, and so he has an extensive history of this. And before I forget, because once this is over, I know it'll be out of my head. A woman from Dayton Historic Preservation was nice enough to drop off some brochures in the back about walking tours, and Bill will also talk a little bit about that. And secondly, we have a generous offer from the Historical Society. If you are a member, we can pull the county records for your property. Now, that doesn't give you the names of all the owners and my wonderful charming history and the patent from Dr. Stansbury, who was the original owner of the home, or the architect, or all the other stories about it. But at least it'll give you a starting point in terms of owners, and then you can start trying to research people and stories. So if you're interested in membership in the Historical Society, see Tom, Deborah Edwards is in the front row here, who is the president of the Historical Society, and we can get you started on. So, without further ado, Bill,
All
thank
right.
you, Bill Stolz.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Great.
Down.
I think we're good. So we're gonna start. Maybe. There we go, quick poll. So how many people live in what they believe is a historic home? Great. How many people have an interest in historic homes or property? And so how many people have done research on a historic property? Wow, okay, so good. So I'm hoping by the time that you leave here today, those research will be able to go out and do research on your property or a property that you're interested in. So there are historic properties everywhere, here in Oakwood and Dayton throughout the United States. We also have those homes. Let's see, I don't have this slide here. We also have those homes in our neighborhoods, or when we drive, we commute to and from work that we see every day and we wonder what happened there. So this is sort of a guide on how to figure out about when the home was built and who lived there. So today we're going to discuss the resources available, how to access material, what the information tells us, and some research tips to make your life easier. So resources we're going to talk about. Yeah.
Could you define what you mean by an historic piece of property?
So I'm going off on the National Park Service for that. So the National Historic Registry, they consider historic any structure that's 50 years old or older, or has some sort of historic significance.
Thank you.
So resources we're going to talk about: city directories, newspapers, city county histories, federal census, maps, because maps are awesome, personal papers, manuscripts, archives, photographs, postcards, and images. So the deed is key. So this is where you want to start your research. If you can get a hold of the deed for your property, this helps you trace ownership. It's a legal document, tells you the buyer and seller, how much and type of sale, when, and the description of property. But I do want to mention it does not describe the structures on the property. So it just gives you a legal description of the actual plat or piece of property. But there are other ways to figure out what the structure or structures look like, and we'll talk about those. So here's a deed from Covington, Kentucky. In red, you have the buyer and seller. Yellow is the sale amount. Green is the property description, and it's one of the blocks in the map at the bottom. It was a whole block at one point, and now it's been broken up throughout the last 120 years into different types of homes and businesses. Also gives you the date. And I want to mention, when you do deed research, if you go to the recorder's office and actually look at deed books, make sure you look in the margin, because often the recorder will put notes in the margins, tell you to see another book, another page. So you want to pay attention to everything that's written on the deed, because often there are clues to previous owners on that specific deed. And so where do you find deeds and legal records and property records? So we have two offices on the county level. We have the county recorder's office and the county auditor. And often people wonder, like, what do they do? So both are found in the county seat. So here in Dayton, you just go downtown. The recorder's office handles land records, and the auditor is our favorite office of all, because they appraise and assess property taxes every year. But they also do a lot with property and have information that's available to all of us. You can make reproductions. Most importantly, you have to remember, these are public offices, and all of the records they hold belong to all of us. So anytime the recorder or the auditor is open, you can go in and access those materials. Nobody can tell you can't come in and make copies, look at records that are held, because they belong to all of us. We're really lucky here in Ohio because materials are really accessible. We're also building record centers in each county to make older records more accessible to researchers. You can also go to the clerk of courts for legal documents, or as I mentioned, the county record centers. And that's something that Ohio's been doing over the last 20+ years, building those. Yeah.
So do you have to have coins to make copies, or can you charge?
That's a question for the recorder. They will have copy machines that may be credit card, maybe coins, and they make them for free.
Or you can use your phone.
Yes, and we'll talk about
Always your
that.
best
Yeah,
friend.
yes, we'll talk about that.
Yes.
So, but always, yeah, the beauty about the cell phones. So you always want to work backwards from the present. So you want to start with you as the owner or getting ready to buy a piece of property. In Ohio, it doesn't matter as much, but if you do research in other states, think about county creation. We all often think our county was created when the state was created, but often counties were created later. They were split from other counties. Northern Kentucky is a perfect example where Campbell County and Kenton County grew out of Campbell County. And so in 1840, when Kenton County was created, any property that was created before 1840, those records still reside over in Campbell County. So you might be doing research in a property and you get stuck because you can find no property records because it might have been in the county where it originated from. So keep that in mind if you want to look at the history of your counties and the state.
Yeah, if you want to go way back to like the turn of the 19th century, like around 1800, there might even be some records down in Cincinnati because before Dayton was large enough, a lot of the sort of administrative stuff, judges and things like that were.
Yeah, that's possible. Yes, yeah. And also you can make copies and scans, but that's why the cell phones are awesome now. You can go in, snap photos. I do want to mention when you're taking pictures, make sure you document where the information came from, because we all get busy. You get home and then a month later, you decide to look at your photos. You have 50 pages of beads, but you don't know where it came from. So you always want to record information. Utilize other resources. We don't think about wills, court records, or mortgages as information that will help you find house research, but they're very valuable. So place to start, the recorder's office. Look down in the bottom there, you can see where it says record online search. You can actually do a lot of searching from home these days, and this gets you back to about the mid 20th century. You can go in, log in as a guest here. I could spend a whole hour talking about how to use the recorder site, so I'm not going to do that today. That'll be your homework assignment to go home and see if you can figure it out. The auditor's site also, this is a quick tip because you can spend time on the recorder's office trying to find information. But if you want quick information to last few owners, I think through the 1990s, you can go to the auditor's website and do a property search by address, name, and so on, parcel number, and you can find information. So I did this home on Oak Avenue, and it gives you a brief description of the property, what it was constructed of, previous owners, but they also give you a year built date. And this comes with a word of caution, because you have to remember when they assess property, they actually don't do historical research on the property. Somebody pulled up and said, oh, that home looks like it's 100 years old, and they come up with a rough date. This structure says 1900, and I think it was actually built back in the 1870s or 1880s. So this is a good place to start because it will tell you when they thought the house was built. So at least you know it might be about 122 years old or older. But take that, like I said, with a word of caution, because it's somebody in a car saying, oh, that house looks really old. But good place to start. And then I mentioned the Montgomery County Record Center and Archives. They're wonderful. They have all of the county records back to 1804. And they actually have a whole page devoted to house and property research that you can utilize. And they're open to the public. They're in the Wright building. If you ever want to go look at the original e-books or put on maps. And there are lots and lots of online resources available where you never have to leave home to do property research. And you can also do property research on properties that aren't located in Ohio. Ancestry, family search, fold tree. We think of those as genealogy tools, but those are tools to do all kinds of research. Library of Congress, which is our library. I'll talk more about later, is an awesome resource as well. And then, of course, the Dayton Metro Library. If you have a Dayton Metro Library card, anyone in Ohio can get one. We have a lot of awesome resources. We have Ancestry.com. That's a subscription database. You can either pay about $30 to $40 a month. This is the only database that Dayton Metro Library has, and you actually have to be in a Dayton Metro location. Ancestry is really weird with their subscriptions, so either you have a personal subscription or you have to be in a wired library to use Ancestry. But a great tool. We have the Dayton Daily News from 1898 to 1922, Dayton Daily from I think 1989 to present, and lots of other resources I'll talk about. And also, most importantly, on the second floor of the main library is our local history room, the Dayton room, that's been collecting and preserving the history of Montgomery County. So they have a lot of resources that are available to you as researchers. And I want to mention Ancestry because I mentioned before we think about ancestry and genealogy, but they have lots of awesome tools to use for house research. They've been digitizing city directories from around the United States from about the 1850s up until today. And we're going to talk more about these later, but these are available in Ancestry. And you can see for Ohio, they have a whole search. You can search by person's name, keyword, information like that, find things. But if you're curious, you can actually go in. They have all of the major cities and counties in Ohio represented, and the earliest city directories for Ohio are 1858. So there's a lot of material in the city directories, as you will see. And I want to mention Family Search too, because this is a free database to the Church of Latter-day Saints, sort of a competitor of Ancestry. They're completely free. You just have to create a membership, but they are collecting and digitizing material from around the world. And one thing they have is they have Ohio death records from 1908 up until the 1950s. So if you're interested to see if anyone ever died in your house, you can check the death records at Family Search. And one of my favorites are the Sanborn fire insurance maps. So Sanborn Fire Insurance Company was founded in the 1860s, and they're still around today. They do more GIS things now, but they were created to map for insurance purposes for potential fires, so they can help business owners, but they also mapped homes and other property as well. And they're very colorful. You can see all the different keys. They tell you what the house is made of, or the structure is made of, brick, steel, tell you what the doors, the windows, the different levels. And so these are just invaluable tools that we can all use. So Dayton Metro Library, we actually have a subscription. You can also subscribe to Sanborn, but we have one. They've digitized 40,000 maps for the state of Ohio from 1882 to 1962. Sanborn didn't go out every year. They went out about every 10 to 12 years to map the different areas with the growth from 1860 up until the 1950s. And you can see, you can do searches. You can see here for Dayton. The only downside to this is the maps they have through the Dayton Metro Library are in black and white. You can see how hard it is to see certain areas. And I think that's part of the description, but there is a workaround. And you can see this is Dayton, Ohio, 1918, volume 3. So you can see them moving out of the city of Dayton into the suburbs. So in about 2020, Kent State University received a huge grant. Back in the 1960s, the Library of Congress had all of the Sanborn maps for every town in the United States, and they didn't want to keep them all in DC, so they found repositories in every state. And Kent State was selected to hold all of Ohio's Sanborn maps, but it wasn't until 2020 or so they got a huge grant to digitize all of these maps. And so Kent State's been working on this, and you can go, it's called the Open Access Kent State University, or OAKS is their library database, where you can use all of these maps. They're TIFF files, they're really large, and you can get a lot of detail, so they're awesome to use. Takes a little while to get used to how it's set up for searching, but we'll see what they look like. So here's that same map I had a couple slides ago from 1918. You can see how different they look in color. Every colored area has a number, and that will take you to a specific page in the Sanborn maps. Wright State University actually has several of the original Sanborn map books, and if you've never seen one, they're about 2.5 feet long by about 3 feet high, and they weigh about 50 to 60 pounds. And they're beautiful. And they sent people out that were true artists that created these, and often it was all hand done. You will often find pages where that person would go out and redo the map for the next 10 years and actually hand cut and paste the buildings on the old buildings. So sometimes you get a whole history of the neighborhood through the work that was done by a Sanborn employee. But I think Wright State has 3 of them for Dayton and a couple for Springfield as well. And you can see, zooming in, here's Dayton, Ohio. You can see the key up close. So it tells you so much information about a structure, like I mentioned, the construction material, doors, windows, everything imaginable about the structure. I helped several years ago when I was in Kenton County, I helped the city engineer. There was an intersection where the intersection kept collapsing, and they couldn't figure out why the pavement kept breaking. And so we came in and we pulled out the Sanborn maps and discovered that there had been an old cistern in the center of that intersection. And that's what was causing the concrete and asphalt to collapse. And so we found it through the Sanborn maps. And you might recognize this area. You can see Oakwood Avenue there on your right. There's Bar Hills, Rubicon. And so you can see the detail. This is 1918. So this is nice too, because you can see all the different plats. You can see all of the homes that are not there yet. So you can see that Oakwood is just starting to develop. And you can see all the homes in yellow and pink. And we're going to focus on sort of the triangle. I think that's the 5 points there. Bar Hills, where it meets Oakwood Avenue. And there's a big condo complex there today. You can zoom in on these maps even more. You can see there were 2 structures on the main piece of the triangle, but at the very bottom, it's hard to see, but that says like Colonel Patterson's cabin. So John H. Patterson brought his grandfather's cabin from Lexington, Kentucky, and it used to sit there up until 1939, and it's actually on the Sanborn map.
There's a plaque there now.
Yes, there is a plaque there now. And I'll talk more about architectural plans, but we don't think often about architectural plans. So Wright State University has the Albert Tretzinger collection, and he was an architect that designed many of the buildings downtown, but also many of the homes in Oakwood. And when I was going through there, this is the mead house that actually sat on that area right just to the, I guess, to the south of the cabin. And you can see what this property looked like. There was the main house, there was a Roman pool in the back, there was a racquetball court. And the next time you go down Far Hills or Oakwood and look at that condo complex, this is the structure of the house that was there up until the 1930s. It was owned by the Meads, and then Lee Cooper owned the Cooper Medicine Company, actually bought it and lived there, and there were several fires. But you can see what a property looked like through the architectural drawings. And then we don't think about the Montgomery County engineer as a resource, but they have aerial maps from 1939. They do it every 10 years when they map the entire county. So you can use aerial to see what areas look like what your neighborhood looked like 80, 90 years ago. So you can see the triangle there from 1938. So it gives you an idea of what it looked like, and you can compare it to today. Due to Google, which I did, so you can see all the changes that have taken place using the county engineer's aerial maps and Google. But I also wanted to mention too that addresses change over time. Do most people know like the zip code didn't come around in the 1960s? So in the United States, it wasn't until after the 1900s they started to actually put addresses on buildings, and prior to that, you could put your own address on your own house. You'd often find, odd and even numbers on the same side of the street. People might have lived in a half or a quarter. And so they did that to make it easier for the post office and the fire and police departments. So addresses have changed over time. There was a big push in the major cities in the 1920s and 30s to uniform all the addresses. Places like Newport, they actually changed all the street names in the 19 teens. So you might live on a street that 100 years ago had a completely different name, and we'll talk about how to figure that out. Also, you think about World War I, all the German street names were all changed. They're all Americanized because of World War I. So often you might have lived, I lived where I used to live, there was a Kaiser Street, and it was changed, I think it's like Smith Street or something now. And then it was changed in 1918, 1919. And I learned about address changes through my wife's aunt. The only job she ever quit was in the 1950s when she was 18 years old. She got a job working for the city manager's office. And in Columbia, Missouri, they decided they were going to go ahead and uniform all of the street addresses. So her first job was they told her that we needed to type like 5,000 postcards to every property owner in Columbia. And she said she was 18, was like, I'm done. But it pulled me in because I realized I knew the exact year the city changed all the addresses. And so it was a real help when we were doing smart property research. And you can see the photo here. This is a house in Covington that actually has 3 different addresses on the front door. So you can see all the address changes in Covington over time. But Sanborn maps and city directories are often tools to figure that out.
So a comment for Oakwood people. Corner homes can have addresses on both streets. And you'll find that some of these homes change their address from one street to the other street for whatever reason. And you get, the fun part is when you look in the auditor's book, because the auditor's tax book, you'll find a home just appears and you go, that didn't just appear in 1965. Well, you had to look on the other street to find out all the records of it before that.
Yeah, and that's great advice because you have to think about, you might get back to 1950 or 1920 and suddenly you can't find anything about your home, or you finally look at a Sanborn map and realize you've been researching your neighbor's home for like the last 3 months. And so it's important to determine the address. Yeah.
Address, it's west of Far Hills, off Shots. It has a 200 block, a 300 block, and a 500 block. That's the whole street.
See little clues like that, you wonder where your property is. And if you look closely, you can't really see it, but down here in the right corner, down here, one of those is 630 and a half, and the other one is 630 and a third. So talk about confusion. But if you see in red, so the Sanborn map makers, when they went out and when addresses or streets changed, they actually put the old address along with the new address. So the Sanborn maps are awesome ways to figure out what your original address was if it changed. And that way you're not researching your neighbor's house for a year. And I mentioned architecture plans. So Wright State, they have the Pretzinger collection. So they have dozens of the homes in Oakwood and many of the buildings downtown. So these are some of the top 2 are Mead family structures. One is a garage, the other one is a hunting lodge here in Oakwood that they built. And then down here's a business down in downtown Dayton. So these are great tools. If you have a home that you think might have plans, it's worth contacting Wright State University's Archive and Special Collections to see what they have. And when I was going through the press center collection, I actually found a map. This was Oakwood in 1907. So they were platting out the town itself. So you find all kinds of really neat things in the architectural collections. And then plat maps. So anytime a piece of property is broken up or platted, they have to turn in a plat map to the county recorder's office. And so these are great tools. It doesn't show you the actual structure, but it shows you the property. And so I went in to look at my home, and you can see this is a plat map for my neighborhood that was built in 1968. So I know my home is no older than 1968 from the plat itself. But you can see I can even find my piece of property, Rule 138 on here. And then here's Salem Village up in West Dayton that was platted in the 1950s. So you can see how they've broken up all the property. So at least you get an idea of what your property looks like. And it gives you more clues because you know your home is not any older than this plat. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about the plat maps. A lot of these have been digitized by the county,
They have.
but darn if I could find an index.
We're going to talk about that shortly. Yes. A lot of these, the indexes aren't the greatest and it takes some detective work, but we'll talk about that. So how do you find a plat? So on your deed will actually have the plat information. And so, but I want to give you a word of caution that you'll see. So this is my deed, and it mentions that my lot was numbered 3,180, and it mentions where it was, but then it mentions at one point the city of West Carrollton changed the plat. So my plat is no longer 3180. It's now 138. So if I hadn't found the deed, I wouldn't have found the original plat. It mentions in the deed that you can go to the Carrollton Manor, section 4, plat book 82, page 80. And that's this is the plat I showed a few slides ago. And that's the plat. So that was listed in the deed. So that's a great place to find that.
So what you'll find here in Oakwood is many of this area that we're sitting in right now was platted before Oakwood became a village. And as a result, you then have to look in Montgomery County, Van Buren Township records, because that's where we were. My home is lot 463, City of Oakwood, but you can't find that going back that far because there ain't no City of Oakwood. You have to find it as, let's see, lot 54, Park Hill plat. So you have names, but there's multiple names for everything, which I'm sure you're going to get to.
Yes. So, and that's why you can go back to the auditor's website, and down in the bottom left, they've done a lot of research where they've been digitizing GIS. They've been digitizing all kinds of resources from the recorder's office to make our lives easier as researchers. So they have a whole, this is called the document. I could do a whole 2-hour workshop on everything they digitize, all of the different types of indexes. The Jordan index is an index of all of the deed books and plat books. I'm not going to say much about that because I really could spend an hour because it's a wonderful tool, but it's really hard to figure out the first time you look at it. But this is would be a great follow-up workshop, how to use some of the books and deeds, the outlots, the deed books, because they've all been digitized, but the way it's set up, it's not that easy to find your property awesome. But the Jordan index, somebody went through and indexed all of the plats. So if you know your plat or your subdivision name, you can use the Jordan index to find that and go to the deed book. But another homework assignment, go home and look at that because that's so awesome resource, but it's not that easy to use. I really appreciate all the work the indexer did, but the county didn't put any explanation on how to use it. So it's one of those where we're going to digitize everything, but you as a taxpayer, you're on your own when it comes to finding stuff. But this is an awesome page to use. I find a lot of information without ever having to leave home. I also want to mention atlases. So that was a great big thing along with the Sanborn maps. Many counties did atlases every 10, 20, 25 years up until the early 20th century. And they started off with a township map. So we're up in Van Buren Township today. You can see Montgomery County there on the right. And you can see how detailed these were. So this is downtown Dayton, one of the neighborhoods. They look a lot like the Sanborn maps. Sometimes they put structures on the map, sometimes they don't. This one is just all the plats. And Wright State University has a lot of the plat books that were done either as atlases or done by the city of Dayton. I think they've got about 30 years worth of those out in their reading room. And then we can look at, here's 1875 Van Buren Township, and you can see up in the upper right, you can see the village of Oakwood there. So you get an idea of all the property. You can see like John Sawyer owned a big chunk to the southeast. So at least you can see who their property owners were at a specific time. And you can see how property has changed over time. And these are really great because they actually put structures on there. They would put churches, schools, buildings, barns, roads. So these atlases are great tools. I was just down in Springboro doing a talk, and we were looking at the 1875 at a house. And the house I was talking about was on the 1875 and the 1865 atlases. So we know the home was at least built, in the 1860s because of the atlases, because it's in the exact same place as the house is today.
So one of the comments with regard to Oakwood, that map you see there is not accurate as to what the settlement of Oakwood was. We went through this earlier this year, researching the 150th anniversary of the founding of the settlement. And there's a little bit of land that goes down that for whatever reason, the Atlas guy didn't put as part of the settlement, but it was.
So there you go. So sometimes these aren't 100% accurate. They also have really great photos of prominent homes and businesses in the county. So this is like many businesses and homes in downtown Dayton, 1875. And now city directories. So these are one of my favorites. I like to call these the phone book before the phone. And today in the 21st century, we worry about privacy. But I mentioned that city directories have been around since the 1850s. And so they have white pages to list the individual, yellow pages for businesses. But the city directory used to list the head of household, the spouse, and anyone else living in the home. So and they would also list the address where you lived. Often for the head of the household, they listed your occupation where you worked. So if that person owed you money, you could look them up in the city directory and just wait for them outside of work. It also listed the spouse and the children. If you had children that were in school, it would just say like students. So you had these are great because it gives you a whole list of the people living in that specific residence or home. List the city streets. This is nice. I mentioned city streets change over time. Every year the city directories list street changes in the front. So if you're researching your home and suddenly you can't find anything, it's nice to look into directories to see if maybe your street changed that specific year. And then in the 1930s, they did what they called the pink pages. They did a crisscross directory where they started indexing property or homes by the address. So if you want to see, you might know your address, but you can't find out who lived there. From about 1932 till today, you can actually go to the pink pages and it lists every single resident every single year at that specific address. And this is really a nice tool if you think your address changed, because the pink pages are broken down by address and intersection. So you can go to an intersection and figure out where your house was if the address may have changed. You can see for Ancestry is digitized 69 Ohio cities and counties. And you can see like Cincinnati goes back to 1852. Columbus 1858 and Dayton 1862. It says 1960 for the copyright, but they're starting to add more and more of the directories. Dayton Metro Library actually and Wright State have full runs of the original city directories. If you want to go down and actually handle a real city directory, head on down to the main library to the second floor around to Wright State because they're really great tools to use. And here's one. This is Cleveland in 1938. So you can see it's just alphabetical list of the people. And they started adding when people got telephones, there's a code for a telephone, different codes for occupation. So like I said before, if you were doing demographic research, these are great to figure out where people work. A lot of the trades that are no longer in existence were listed in the directories. And here's the pink pages in Covington, Kentucky, 1938. So it's by address. And this is one where people have little bells. So, in 1938, if there's a bell, that person actually had a telephone. Photograph collections. So Dayton Metro Library, we have Dayton Remembered that's preserving the history of the Miami Valley. So we've been digitizing tens of thousands of photos of Dayton and Montgomery County, the towns and communities. And that's fully searchable online. I also want to mention, I talked a little bit about the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress is our library in DC, and they do a lot of wonderful things to preserve our history that even here in Dayton, Ohio, they have things that affect and help all of us. So one of the things they have is they have the Historic American Building Survey, And this started in the 1930s during the Great Depression for the Work Projects Administration, where they sent historians out and architects out to document structures. And they took photos and wrote essays about each structure that they were researching. And these are all digitized and available online for the Library of Congress. Also want to mention newspapers, because these are my favorite. I mentioned before, we have the Dayton Daily News digitized, 1898 to 1922, Ohio Memory, which is part of the Ohio History Connection, which used to be the Ohio Historical Society, Chronicling America, which we'll talk about shortly, public and university libraries. The Dayton Metro has a huge newspaper collection capturing the newspapers of Montgomery County and many of the other Miami Valley counties. They have microfilm machines, digital, they can go down and look at those. We also have the Dayton Daily in original paper format that you can go down with a large scanner where you can scan articles from the original newspaper if you don't want to look at microfilm. People don't realize that Wright State University has the Ohio Historical Newspaper Collection, where they've been preserving microfilm for all the counties that make up the Miami Valley, where they have hundreds of newspapers on microfilm at Wright State. They're a public university, so all of the newspapers belong to all of us. So you can go in anytime they're open and search their microfilm up there at the Wright State to find newspapers for all of the Miami Valley. The ones that have been digitized, you can search like the Dayton Daily, you can search by your address, street name, owner, or occupant. You might have lived in a house that at one point was rental property or broken up into apartments. And, we think Sundays now, we get the big flashy real estate sections in color every Sunday, but that's nothing new. We've been doing that for like over 100 years. So there used to be a whole page in the newspaper almost every day devoted to homes and home styles, especially in the teens and 20s up to the 1940s, where as we were developing more and more suburban areas, they were featuring different homes and architects. And so this is what it looks like. The Dayton Daily from 1898 to 1922 is the full newspaper, fully searchable, and you get the full page. And this is fun because we think about newspapers and the news and about how sensational everything is. But this is the headline for like 1920 one day. And so, murder and mayhem in the newspaper is nothing new. And then Chronicling America. So this started probably about 20 years ago. The Library of Congress decided they wanted to preserve American newspapers, especially the smaller, more obscure newspapers. And they started traveling around the entire United States, digitizing all the newspapers. And so this is a wonderful, fully searchable tool where you can go to the Library of Congress and search like 400 years of newspapers in the United States. You can search by person, address, and so on, and get the full newspaper. But you'll see I highlighted all, they've digitized newspapers in the United States in 1836. It says 1922, but with copyright, if the newspapers no longer exist, they have some up to the 1950s and 60s now. But where the red arrow is in the upper right-hand corner, they have a U.S. newspaper directory from 1690 to today, where they have documented what every single newspaper ever printed in the United States is. And it tells you the newspaper name, the run of the newspaper, if it changed names over time, but most importantly, it tells you the format that it's available in and where you can find it. And so if you're looking, if you're doing like family research around the United States, and you're looking for newspapers, this is a great tool to find newspaper articles. I was doing research on my great-grandfather's World War I experience. I couldn't find anything about him or his unit, but I started using Chronicling America, and there was a really small town in Oklahoma that one of the members of my great-grandfather's unit was writing letters home to Oklahoma, and they were printing information about his service in Europe. And so I was able to track my great-grandfather's location, even when he returned home on the specific ship he returned home on in 1919 to New York City through this Oklahoma newspaper. And if it wasn't for Chronicling America, I would not have any of that information. And you can see it actually breaks down all the newspapers by name. It tells you the number of issues. You can see some of the newspapers are 1,000 of issues, other ones are like maybe a dozen. It tells you the run of the newspaper, all kinds of information. And when you click on the blue and actually look at the original newspaper, calendar tells you what days or the runs. But you can see they digitized 181 Ohio newspapers from 1834 up to 1962. And these are why newspapers are awesome. So you actually find neighborhoods that are platted or subdivisions where the Dayton Daily would do an article. So here's a house on Waterville Leaf, and I actually found the 1916 article about this plat opening. This was one of the two original homes in that area on Water Leak that was developed, and the house looks just like it did in 1916. And so if you have a house and you're wondering what it looked like when it was built, often the newspaper will have a photograph.
Well, this is the equivalent of an infomercial
Yes.
in 1916. Because you can bet Dayton Daily News didn't put that up, but the plat guy who laid the plat out and wanted to sell lots. I'm sure that was the individual who commissioned. it.
Yes, yes, and also people like real estate agents, auctions. And here's another homework assignment, because there are lots of photos of the exteriors of homes, but how many people regularly take photos of the inside? And so when I work in part of my library, like people often say, I'm looking for photos of the inside of my house. And so unless you get lucky and have family papers where people were documenting like a holiday or a birthday and there are pictures, very few people ever take pictures of the insides of businesses or homes. So you all need to go home and take pictures of the interior and make sure they exist for the next generation. But these are often great too, because the developer or the real estate agent or the seller will often list a description of what the inside of the house looks like. There were some homes in Covington we were doing research on, and they would write like 2 or 3 paragraphs talking about the type of floor, the type of tile in the bathroom, what the tub looks like. So you get a written description of the interior based on the article in the newspaper. And then here's a home in Oakwood for sale. The owner's leaving the city on March 1st. This is 1922. And you can see described how you can buy a house among the trees at a low price. But you can see 100 years later, the house is almost identical.
Same. 68 is the house next door. That's 64, I think. We know 68 because 68, a church went through and redid that house in 1989. And my wife and I looked at it and I thought, oh, it's gonna be $10,000 more than what I could possibly pay. But I easily put that into the house that I bought instead. So, but I think that's the house next door.
I don't know, they look pretty similar.
That's based on-
Yeah, driveway,
It's missing the attic window now.
yeah.
Maybe so, I don't know. That doesn't look like
It's
68.
got the same,
That was the house.
chip roof, it's got the same 3 steps.
Yeah, driveway the same.
Same.
Yeah.
Maybe so, okay.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah,
So I pulled down the real estate listing for my house, all the photos from the 2 prior times it was for sale. So even just the one owner, he listed it multiple times,
yes,
and even they'd even changed within those 2 sets of photos, so yeah.
yeah, and it's amazing too, because like when you go to the auditor's site, the different photos, how people change things over time. And I want to mention too, like a word of caution with newspapers, because when you start doing your house research and you jump into the newspapers, sometimes you find out things you don't want to find out about your house. So I just want to mention that. So if you don't want to find out certain things about your house, newspapers are not the best place to go. So I was helping people in Covington, Kentucky. The person was doing, if you know anything about Newport and the gambling, you know, the Vegas before Vegas. So I was helping somebody who discovered that his house had been raided because they had slot machines in the basement. And then I had a guy come in that lived in Erlanger and said, I have this barn in my backyard. And I'm really curious, like how long the barn has been there, if there's any information. So we started doing research and I found this Kentucky Post article and you can see all these different mug shots. And here is the article, piece of the article. So it turns out this quintet was actually, they were gangsters from Chicago that were robbing banks, cracking safes. They actually killed a police officer in Indianapolis, came through Ohio, Dayton, Cincinnati, and they wound up in Erlanger in this guy's barn. And the state police showed up and you can see they raided it, they caught them all, and they mentioned in the arsenal. So they had Thompson submachine guns, a box of dynamite, a BAR, and to imagine they actually arrested all of them in this barn. And so like the property owner, like, here's a story you never anticipated you would find out that there was a huge standoff in your barn between gangsters and the police at the end of Prohibition. So it's March 1933, so Prohibition was literally at the end. So the whole gangster area was going to, but you can see that we're Chicago and St. Louis gangsters. So those things you never know. And I want to mention personal and family papers because we don't think about those as house tools, but often families will donate materials to archives. And we'll have those forever. So I was researching a structure in Covington, and I found out that Northern Kentucky University had an archives for this family. So, and they had digitized a lot of their material. So I started going through the letters, and I actually found this, the home I was researching, I figured it was built in the 1840s, but I found a letter from a granddaughter to her grandmother in 1853. Her father had just purchased the home. It was a former female school, and the professor that owned the home was selling it to a family. So it was built as a school, and the family, the Bruce family, was actually buying it to move in as a resident. And this 9-year-old girl was writing her grandmother describing the home and the property in 1853. And you can read, if you go down to this area now on Greenup, it's high density, but to imagine it was a 4-acre estate in 1853, a brick home on the Licking and Sixth yard. It mentions the garden, they had fruit trees and evergreens, 50 peach trees were growing there, and they used to go out and fish in the Licking River on property. But it also mentions there was a stable there, a spring house, and it's all through the eyes of a young grandchild writing her grandmother. And it's all preserved forever. And so then 10 years later, I went to the US Census. US Census comes out every 10 years, started in 1790. The last one was released, believe it or not, on April Fool's Day of this year of 2022. Federal government, our magic number is 72 years for privacy. And so they release it every 72 years. So the 1950 census is out now. One thing to think in mind, our federal government is really good about putting really rare documents in wooden buildings. They only copy. So sadly, the 1890 census burned. So that's a pivotal time period for many of us. Our families migrated to the United States, trying to figure out where they were. But this is a great tool to figure out who lived in your house too. So it's every 10 years from 1790 through 1950 are all available on Family Search and Ancestry right now. So I went and looked at the house in 1863 in the midst of the Civil War, and the Bruce family was still living in that house. And you can see Pauline is now a teenager, and her grandmother, who was living somewhere else, is now living in that house. So using the census, you get a description of who lived in the house. They had several servants that lived there, but you can see how large the family was, and also the servant staff that was working in that house in 1863. Other records, I mentioned the Historical American Building Survey. This is still ongoing. They've been doing this for about 90+ years now, so you can add photos and information if there are homes that are not already enhanced the Library of Congress. The National Registry of Historic Places, I mentioned before what a historic building is or structure. That is actually run through the National Park Service, believe it or not. And so they're the ones that determine you can, if you have a home that you feel was historic, 50 years old, or a historical significance, you yourself can write an application to be on the National Registry. Before I moved back to Dayton, our entire neighborhood in Bellevue, Kentucky, we had this beautiful neighborhood that was built in 1928. They're all brick homes, and every home looks the same except the porch. The builder changed every single porch. So there were about 50 homes that are very unique. And we were really worried that if we didn't do something to preserve the history of our 2-street neighborhood, that people would move in, developers would move in and tear down these little bungalows to build other houses. So we got together as a neighborhood, and the city helped us hire a consultant to write an application, and it's now in the National Registry. So it's a whole history of this 100-year history of our neighborhood. They digitized all of their, so that anytime you submit an application, the National Park Service has digitized all the applications. So they're available to download, and they include photographs and the really extensive applications. Some of them are like 50 to 60 pages long, where they describe either the single structure or all the structures in a specific neighborhood or area. So they're great tools. Things to think about: will, estate records, and probate. We don't think of those about home research, but they're very useful when people pass property and homes back and forth. Those are available to the county clerk. Then we have published sources like city and county histories. So especially between like 1870 and the 1920s, prominent people in cities and counties wrote these great big thick histories of their counties, but they also wrote like page after page about themselves. But they're great tools because they describe homes and towns and neighborhoods. Other things to think about: I mentioned the Dayton Metro Library. Think about university archives and special collections like Wright State with the Pretzinger collection. County, you've got city, county, and other local historical societies. County clerk. Think about local organizations like Preservation Dayton has walking tours, but they also do thought to document buildings and homes in the city of Dayton and grab brochure on the way out. Research facilities like the Montgomery County Record Center, holding all of our records, and it goes back to 1804. We have state repositories like the Ohio History Connection. We also have the Library of Congress and the National Archives that have material. So that's it. Thank you. I will take questions. Yeah,
So if you're just getting started from scratch, you're the expert, where do you recommend you start?
I would start with the deed, trying to see if you can track from you far back if you can get through the deed. But if you know, I would also jump in the newspaper too, because you can find a lot of stuff in the newspapers. And did you get one of the research sheets I have? Yeah, that's a great way to start, try to document the house. Yeah,
Is there a place to get copies of all your slides?
I can send them to the Historical Society and make them available.
Yeah, there's just so much to.
It is.
Right now.
It's way too much information.
Yeah.
And that's why I didn't even touch on the county, that we could spend 2 hours looking at the county resources. Yeah,
How difficult is this research to do if you live out of state?
it all depends on the city, county, and state where that property is and what they've made available. But using Sanborn maps, and other databases, newspaper databases, you can find a lot of information on a property in another state without actually having to contact or travel. Yeah.
Just real quickly, I have a question for a plug for the Urban Historical Society, because we do have the databases. That would be a really good place to start. Is become a member and let us pull owners' names and the property records that we have so that you can go from there. Second question is real quickly. You talked about downloading real estate photos internal. How did you do that? Because I wasn't able to do
For some reason, they were still listed on Zillow.
it. To my knowledge.
So, yeah, so I've got like 162 pictures.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know past realtors, but I've gone and tried to search the address and can't find.
It depends on your realtor.
Mhm.
So like some of the open realty, they'll be really deliberate about deleting photos online, but
Okay.
sometimes not that it's bad, it's just.
Yeah, and then my mom's house, I can pull up the photos from her house for years, but I can.
If you want really old pictures, one of our neighbors on Mart and Orlando actually found some old photos of our street circa 1917 at the Dayton Art Institute. So apparently, I don't know if it was intended to be an archive of photographs of Oakwood, but for whatever reason, they were taking pictures of Oakwood.
Architectural drawings.
Yes.
for
And
the
these were
art
actually,
school.
like
Yeah.
street shots of,
That's maybe a copy.
yeah.
And I'll mention too, you may not know about something called archive.org. And there's something called the Wayback Machine where you can take URLs. They capture every week, every URL or website out there. So, and it goes back to, I think, to about probably 2002 or earlier, where you can actually just go to the Wayback Machine, plug in a URL, and if they captured it, all of that stuff is available. So that might be a place to look for old photos too. Yes.
I was just wondering if Oakwood has, or if there's one record that would show of Oakwood, the first house, the second house, and have it would list the actual chronology in first.
Wow, that might be a question for the Historical Society.
Well, we obviously know what some of the earlier homes were, but those are sometimes really hard to date, going back that far. You know, we have houses that go back to the 1860s, we have houses that go back even further than that. You know, prime examples are the early farmhouses. I was just telling him, this house that sits right out here of this window, that is an early farmhouse that was once originally on this land. This was the farm for that house that's across the street now. It was the granddaughter of John Schroyer, Emma Conover. And this was her farmland, and that house originally sat here. So these houses go back. There's one on Spirea, probably what we think may be the oldest house still standing. Obviously, there's several that have been torn down. Maysfield is a good example of that no longer exists. But that was one of the earliest houses here. That was actually lived in by the grandson of William Henry Harrison at one point. But then went on to be owned by a parrot. But one of the earliest standing houses was originally part of Colonel Patterson's land, and it still exists over on Rubicon. And this house is ours. Oh, yes, and I also have some blueprints in your house that and I've been wanting to talk to you about. They're obviously not original blueprints, but they're old blueprints. And that house was very interesting because it was an Olmsted property, but it was probably, and then it became part of Oakwood. Patterson's son, Robert Patterson, moved into it, but it dates even further back to that. And that's a good example too, because that house has given us headaches because it's had about 3 different addresses. Streets and everything else, but we have found a lot of, I've been wanting to tell you, we've been finding a lot of information about that house. That's probably one of the oldest. There's another one on Spirea that is probably, everybody calls that the original Schaefer home. We have reason to believe that house was existing when the Schaefers moved into it, so we think it's even older than that.
But there's even ones that hide among the rest of the houses.
Yeah.
You go to 436 East, I think 436
It's
East Drive.
Down by
If
Shore.
you drive down East Drive in the 4th block, there's a house that you drive past and it just looks like all the other ones. But it's just a little different. And when you look closely, you go, that house wasn't built in the 1940s. Because that house was built, what, 1860 something?
Well, we could date it back until at least the 1860s. We think it was originally John Wonderly's farm home. And if you look at it, if you stop and look at it, you can tell it's a farm home. It has the original stone foundation. It's back a little bit more. There's another house on Telford that belonged to Emma Conover's daughter that was on this property. It's a little bit new, but it's now down.
Yeah, they moved it. They moved
That's
the
on
home.
Telford. Yeah, they moved that home and they moved the house on Telford, but there are quite a few. There's the house on Oakwood, the brick house that when you're coming up, I think it's 3 years, that's what they call that the old house, but we've seen it. Well, Tom and I differ on this. I think it goes back further than the old. So it's very hard when you start getting back into the 1840s, 50s of knowing what exactly was the oldest house here. I will tell you, one of the oldest residents was the Warmer family, and they lived over by Sugar Camp, and they were here as early as the 1800s. So, and they had a cabin there, obviously still doesn't exist, but that's not a name a lot of Oakwood people are familiar with, but they were one of the earliest residents.
Thank you. Any other questions?
So we have a comment from the chat. So this is to you. I've already been digging for deeds as per your advice, and I've already found much more than I had the last few months.
Oh, great.
So that's the power of being on Zoom.
Yes.
While he's talking, you can be talking.
Yeah, yes. So on the information sheet I handed out, there are 2 different email addresses for me. So if you start doing home research and have questions or quandaries, don't hesitate to email or give me a call or stop by. I'm over at the